There exists a terror so ancient, so wordless, that it lives beneath the architecture of your conscious mind like a shadow cast by a flame that was extinguished before you learned to speak. This fear has no date of birth in your memory, no story to explain its presence, no face to confront. Yet it moves through your nervous system like a ghost returning to a house it never truly left. What if what paralyzes you most today wasn't born in your conscious history, but in the emotional atmosphere that received you before your first cry? What if the deepest tremor in your soul is not a wound you created, but an inheritance you absorbed when you were nothing more than possibility swimming in cellular darkness? The body remembers what consciousness cannot reach. In those first months of existence, when you were pure sensitivity without boundaries, your nervous system was already learning the emotional temperature of the world that awaited you. Your mother's heartbeat was your first rhythm, her stress hormones your first chemical education about whether this world was safe or dangerous. Before the ego existed, before language could name experience, before memory could file away moments into categories of mine and not mine, the body was already feeling. And fear, at that stage, forms a language with no words, a somatic grammar written in muscle tension, in breath patterns, in the subtle ways your nervous system learned to contract or expand in response to the emotional climate of your beginning. This is not the fear of tigers or heights or public speaking. This is the fear of existence itself, the terror that whispers, maybe I shouldn't be here. Maybe there's no place for me. Maybe I am too much, or not enough, or somehow fundamentally wrong. It's the fear that lives in the pause between heartbeats, in the moment before you speak your truth, in the space between reaching out and being seen. Jung spoke of the collective unconscious, but there is something even more intimate than that. The cellular unconscious, the way trauma and fear can be transmitted through the very substance of our becoming. The mother's unresolved grief becoming the child's inexplicable anxiety. The father's abandoned dreams becoming the daughter's fear of her own power. The ancestral terror of persecution becoming the grandson's panic in moments of visibility. Your deepest fear might not be a memory you can recover through therapy or meditation. It might be a memory your cells carry from before you had a self to remember with, a memory of emotional abandonment so early that it became the foundation upon which your sense of self was built, a memory of not being felt, not being welcomed, not being met with the kind of love that says, yes, you belong here. Yes, your existence is a gift. The body's unconscious carries invisible records, from the womb, from the lineage, from the emotional state of those who were meant to hold space for your arrival. Sometimes the deepest healing begins not with remembering, but with recognizing that what you've always thought was wrong with you might simply be the echo of a fear that was never truly yours to carry. This is where the journey toward your authentic self begins, not by fixing what's broken, but by understanding what was inherited. Not by conquering fear, but by tracing it back to its wordless origin and offering it the compassion it never received when it first took root in the sacred darkness of your becoming. She was 43 when she finally understood why crowds felt like drowning. In therapy, exploring a panic attack that had left her trembling in a grocery store, she found herself speaking words that surprised her. I feel like I'm taking up space that doesn't belong to me. The therapist asked her to close her eyes and feel where that sensation lived in her body. Her hands moved instinctively to her solar plexus, then lower to her belly. It's like I was never supposed to be here, she whispered, tears falling for a reason she couldn't name. What she was touching was not a memory from childhood, but something far more ancient, the cellular record of gestation spent in a womb that was emotionally absent, where her mother's unresolved depression had created an atmosphere of psychic emptiness. The first abandonment had been the absence of emotional resonance before her first breath. This is the symbolic trauma that haunts so many of us. Not the trauma of what was done to us, but the trauma of what was not felt for us when we were most vulnerable. When the mother is psychically absent, lost in her own unhealed wounds, overwhelmed by circumstances, or emotionally unavailable due to depression or anxiety, the developing child absorbs the void as the foundation of the self. The ancient wisdom traditions understood this. In Tibetan Buddhism, the concept of the bardo speaks of the liminal spaces between states of being, where consciousness is most malleable and impressionable. The womb is perhaps the most profound bardo of all, a space where the soul is preparing to incarnate, where the very architecture of belonging or exile is being constructed through the mother's emotional availability. Neuroscientist Alan Shaw's research on affect regulation reveals that the right brain hemisphere, which governs emotional processing and attachment, develops primarily through the quality of emotional attunement the infant experiences. But this development begins in utero. The fetus is already learning whether emotional states are safe to feel, whether needs are met with responsiveness, whether existence itself is welcomed or merely tolerated. When emotional mirroring is absent during gestation, the child learns a fundamental lesson. My inner world doesn't matter. My feelings are too much. I am alone in my experience. This becomes the unconscious blueprint for relationships, for self-worth, for the way they move through the world. The deep fear of existing, of taking up space, of having needs, of being seen, originates in this early lack of emotional attunement. Consider the man who sabotages every relationship just as it deepens, not because he doesn't want love, but because love feels like an invasion. His nervous system learned in the womb that closeness equals danger, that being fully present in relationship means risking annihilation. His fear of intimacy is not a character flaw. It's a survival strategy formed before he had the capacity to choose. Or the woman who achieves success but can never enjoy it, always feeling like an imposter about to be discovered. Her cellular memory carries the imprint of a gestation where her mother felt overwhelmed by the prospect of another child, where her very existence felt like a burden rather than a blessing. Achievement becomes a way to justify her presence in the world, but the joy remains elusive because the foundation was built on the quicksand of unwelcome. This is not about blaming mothers. The mothers too are carrying their own inherited fears, their own cellular memories of not being fully received. This is about understanding that what we often label as social anxiety, or low self-esteem, or fear of commitment, might actually be the echo of an existential terror that was absorbed before consciousness could protect us from it. The mystic poet Rumi wrote, "You are not just the drop in the ocean, but the ocean in each drop." Yet for so many, the first experience of being a drop was the sensation of falling into an ocean that didn't recognize them, didn't celebrate their arrival, didn't offer the kind of emotional holding that says, "Welcome, beloved. We have been waiting for you." When the soul arrives into a world that doesn't feel it, doesn't mirror its emotional reality, doesn't offer the gift of genuine presence, it learns to hide its deepest truth. It learns that authenticity is dangerous, that need is shameful, that the very core of who they are is somehow too much for this world to hold. But here is what the fear doesn't want you to know, that early absence was not a reflection of your worth. It was simply the limitation of those who were meant to welcome you. Their inability to feel you fully was their wound, not your wrongness. Your deepest terror of being too much or not enough is not a truth about you. It's the ghost of an emotional environment that couldn't hold the fullness of what you came here to be. There is a language written in chemicals that your body speaks fluently, though your mind has never learned to translate it. It's the language of cortisol cascading through your bloodstream when a deadline approaches, of adrenaline flooding your system when someone raises their voice, of the inexplicable exhaustion that settles into your bones when you try to rest. This chemical conversation has been happening since before you had words, since before you had a name, since you were nothing more than a cluster of dividing cells learning the biochemical weather of your first world. In the laboratory of the womb, Your nervous system was already conducting its first experiments in survival. When your mother experienced chronic stress, whether from poverty, relationship conflict, unresolved trauma, or simply the overwhelming demands of existence, her elevated cortisol levels didn't remain contained within her own bloodstream. They crossed the placental barrier like whispered warnings, teaching your developing brain that the world outside was a place requiring constant vigilance. Dr. Rachel Yehuda's groundbreaking research on intergenerational trauma reveals how the effects of stress can be passed down through epigenetic changes, modifications that don't alter DNA sequences but change how genes are expressed. The children of Holocaust survivors, she discovered, carried the biological markers of their parents' trauma in their own stress response systems, even though they had never experienced the original traumatic events themselves. This is the neurochemistry of inherited pain, the way terror becomes encoded in our cellular memory, passed down through bloodlines like an ancestral language of survival. Your grandmother's fear of abandonment, never processed or healed, becomes your mother's inability to fully attach. Your mother's unresolved anxiety becomes the chemical environment of your gestation. Your nervous system learns to live in a state of alert before it learns to trust the safety of being held. Consider the woman who cannot understand why her body goes into fight or flight when her partner tries to comfort her during moments of vulnerability. Her rational mind knows she is safe, knows she is loved, yet her nervous system responds to intimacy as if it were a threat. What she may be experiencing is not her own fear, but the cellular memory of her mother's terror of being truly seen, a fear so deep it was transmitted through the biochemical environment of her earliest development. The polyvagal theory, developed by Dr. Stephen Porges, helps us understand how the vagus nerve, the longest cranial nerve that connects the brain to the body, develops its patterns of response based on early experiences of safety or danger. When the developing nervous system is bathed in stress hormones during gestation, it learns to default to states of hypervigilance or dissociation as primary survival strategies. Your body learned to survive before it learned to trust. This is not a failure of character or a weakness of will. It's the profound intelligence of a nervous system that absorbed the emotional climate of its first environment and organized itself accordingly. The chronic anxiety you cannot explain, the way your stomach clenches when you're about to speak your truth, the inexplicable fatigue that comes after moments of joy, these may be the cellular echoes of fears that were never originally yours. But there is something your fear doesn't want you to discover: neuroplasticity. The same brain that learned patterns of terror before birth retains the capacity to learn new patterns throughout life. The neural pathways carved by inherited trauma are not permanent highways. They are footpaths that can be grown over, redirected, transformed through conscious practice and somatic healing. The body that once learned to contract in the face of emotional overwhelm can learn to expand. The nervous system that develops strategies of disconnection to survive can learn the safety of remaining present. The biochemical patterns that once served as protection can be rewired through practices that teach the body what it means to be held, to be safe, to belong. This is not about positive thinking your way out of inherited trauma. This is about understanding that the fear living in your cells carries information, both about what was survived and what is still seeking healing. When you feel that familiar surge of panic in moments that should be safe, you might be feeling not just your own fear, but the unprocessed terror of those who came before you, asking through your nervous system to finally be witnessed, acknowledged, and released. The neurochemistry of inherited pain is also the neurochemistry of inherited resilience. The same genetic mechanisms that can transmit trauma can also transmit healing. When you learn to regulate your nervous system, when you develop the capacity to remain present with difficult emotions, when you create new neural pathways of safety and connection, you are not only healing yourself, you are healing the lineage. You are breaking biochemical patterns that may have been passed down through generations, creating new possibilities for those who will come after you. Your deepest fear might be a chemical conversation that began before you were born, but it doesn't have to be the conversation that defines the rest of your life. In the ancient Celtic tradition, there was a belief that souls choose their lineages not as punishment, but as sacred assignment, that we arrive through bloodlines that carry both the wounds and the medicine we are meant to transform. What if the fears that feel most intimately yours are actually archetypal patterns, moving through your family's soul like underground rivers, seeking someone brave enough to finally bring them into the light? She discovered it in her dreams first. Night after night, the same vision, standing at the edge of a village while everyone she loved turned their backs and walked away. She would wake with a terror so primal it felt like dying, though nothing in her waking life explained such profound abandonment anxiety. It wasn't until she began exploring her family history that the pattern revealed itself. A great-grandmother who had been cast out of her community for falling in love with someone outside her religion. A grandmother who had hidden her true self for decades to avoid rejection. A mother who had never learned to trust that love wouldn't evaporate without warning. What she was dreaming was not her fear, but the archetypal fear of exile that had been passed down through her lineage like a sacred wound seeking witness. She was the one chosen to feel it fully, to name it, to finally transform it into wisdom. This is the archetype of the exile, one of the most profound inherited fears that moves through family systems. It carries the cellular memory of persecution, of being cast out from the tribe, of survival depending on becoming invisible or acceptable. The descendants of those who fled pogroms carry it. The grandchildren of immigrants who had to hide their accents carry it. The children of anyone who learned that authenticity could mean death carry it. But there is also the archetype of the abandoned child. The fear that lives in those whose lineages carry stories of mothers who died in childbirth, of fathers who left for wars and never returned, of babies given away because there was no other choice. This fear whispers, everyone will leave. Love is temporary, don't get too attached. It moves through generations until it finds someone with enough consciousness to recognize it not as personal pathology, but as ancestral grief seeking completion. Marion Woodman, the Jungian analyst, spoke of how we become carriers for the unconscious material of our families, how certain souls incarnate specifically to feel and integrate the unprocessed emotions of the lineage. What you experience as your most private terror might actually be the concentrated suffering of those who came before you, distilled into your sensitive nervous system because you are the one equipped to finally heal it. The man who cannot commit to relationships despite desperately wanting love is not just afraid of intimacy. He may be carrying the archetypal pattern of the betrayed lover, inherited from a grandfather who discovered his wife's affair but never processed the rage and heartbreak, or a great-aunt whose fiancé disappeared before their wedding, leaving her suspicious of love's reliability. The fear lives in the bloodline until someone with enough courage agrees to feel it completely and break the pattern. There is the archetype of the silenced voice, found in lineages where speaking truth meant danger, where women were not allowed to have opinions, where children were seen but not heard, where creativity was luxury only the wealthy could afford. The descendants carry an inexplicable terror of visibility, of taking up space, of sharing their gifts with the world. They self-sabotage not from personal inadequacy, but from cellular loyalty to those who had to stay hidden to survive. And there is the archetype of the unworthy one, moving through families that carry stories of poverty, of not being good enough for better opportunities, of dreams deferred because people like us don't do that. The inherited fear of success, of having more than those who sacrificed for you, of somehow betraying the family system by transcending its limitations. These are not just psychological patterns, they are soul contracts, what Clarissa Pinkola Estes calls psychic inheritance, the way certain family members become the vessels through which ancestral trauma seeks transformation. You didn't choose these fears to punish yourself. You chose them because your soul knew it had the capacity to feel them fully and transform them into gifts. The woman who heals her exile fear becomes someone who can hold space for others who don't belong. The man who transforms his commitment terror becomes someone who can love with extraordinary depth. The person who overcomes the fear of visibility becomes a voice for those who are still hiding. This is loyalty to pain, transformed into loyalty to truth, when we stop carrying the fears as burden and start recognizing them as assignment. When we understand that our most private terrors might actually be the concentrated essence of our lineage's unfinished business, seeking someone conscious enough to finally bring them home. First CTA, mid-video. If this is resonating with something deep in your cellular memory, something you've never been able to name, let me know in the comments what archetypal pattern you recognize in your own lineage. Sometimes, naming the fear is the first step to transforming it from curse into gift. Your family didn't pass down fear to harm you. They passed it down because your soul was strong enough to be the one who finally turns poison into medicine, terror into wisdom, wounds into doorways for healing that reaches backward and forward through time itself. There is a woman who has been holding her breath for 37 years, though she doesn't know it. She breathes, of course, the mechanical in and out that keeps her alive. But she has never learned to breathe as if she belongs here, as if her presence is welcome, as if the air itself is eager to fill her lungs with the affirmation of existence. When her therapist asks her to take a deep breath, her chest freezes, her throat constricts, and she begins to cry for reasons that seem to come from before language. What she is discovering is that the body remembers what the mind cannot access. Every unexplained tension, every chronic ache, every breath that stops short of fullness is a message from the cellular unconscious, a somatic letter written in the alphabet of survival and seeking someone literate enough to translate its meaning. The mystic Hildegard of Bingen understood this 8 centuries ago when she wrote of viriditas, the green life force that flows through all living things. She knew that trauma creates what she called desiccation, a drying up of this vital force, and that healing required not just prayer or herbs, but a return to the body's natural rhythms of expansion and contraction, of receiving and releasing. Your body is not just housing your consciousness, it is housing the consciousness of your lineage. The way your shoulders curve forward in protection may be carrying the memory of your grandfather, who learned to make himself small to avoid the overseer's attention. The chronic pain in your lower back may be holding the weight of your grandmother's unexpressed grief. The digestive issues that have no medical explanation may be your body's way of processing the hunger, emotional and physical, that your ancestors endured. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's research on trauma and the body reveals that traumatic memories are stored not in the narrative centers of the brain, but in the limbic system and the body's sensory networks. This is why you can't think your way out of inherited fear, because it lives below the level of thought, in the realm of sensation, breath, and cellular memory. But this is also why the body becomes the most powerful portal for healing. What was encoded in sensation can be transformed through sensation. What was learned through breath can be retaught through breath. What was stored in muscle and bone can be released through conscious touch, movement, and presence. She began with small rituals. Each morning, before the world could tell her who to be, she would place her hands on her belly and breathe as if she were breathing for the first time. Not the shallow breathing of anxiety, but the full oceanic breathing of someone who had finally been given permission to take up space. She imagined she was breathing not just for herself, but for all the women in her lineage who had forgotten they deserved to fill their lungs completely. This is what somatic healing understands that traditional therapy sometimes misses, that the body holds not just trauma, but also the blueprints for wholeness. Your nervous system may have learned patterns of constriction and hypervigilance, but it also remembers the original impulse toward expansion, connection, and joy. Every cell in your body carries both the memory of wounding and the template for restoration. The tremors that run through your body when you try to speak your truth are not signs of weakness. They are the body's way of shaking off generations of silence. The tears that come when someone holds you with genuine presence are not just your tears. They are the tears of everyone in your lineage who never got to be held in their pain. The exhaustion you feel after finally saying no to something that doesn't serve you is not just your exhaustion. It is the accumulated tiredness of those who said yes when they meant no, who bent when they needed to stand, who disappeared themselves to keep the peace. Peter Levine's work with somatic experiencing teaches us that trauma is not what happens to us, but what happens inside us when we cannot complete the natural cycle of activation and discharge. The fears inherited before birth often create incomplete cycles, nervous system activation that has been suspended for generations, seeking completion through our bodies. Integration begins by learning to listen to your symptoms as the soul's voice rather than the body's betrayal. That chronic tension in your jaw might be holding words your grandmother never got to speak. The way your heart races when you're about to be truly seen might be carrying your great-grandfather's terror of persecution. The insomnia that visits during times of transition might be the accumulated vigilance of ancestors who had to stay awake to survive. But here is the profound gift hidden in somatic healing. When you learn to breathe through the panic instead of avoiding it, when you learn to stay present with the trembling instead of numbing it, when you learn to let your body feel its feelings completely, you are not just healing yourself, you are providing the completion that your lineage has been seeking for generations. There are simple rituals that can begin this reconnection. Touch your chest and acknowledge, this heart has been beating since before I had a name. Feel the pulse beneath your palm, not just your pulse, but the echo of every heart that has ever beaten in your bloodline. When anxiety arises, instead of fighting it, place both hands on your belly and breathe as if you are breathing life back into your ancestry. Imagine your breath reaching not just your lungs, but the cellular memory of those who forgot they deserved to exist fully. Before sleep, trace your hands along your arms, your legs, your torso, and whisper, "Thank you for carrying what I couldn't yet heal. Thank you for holding the pain until I was ready to transform it." The body that learned to contract in fear can learn to expand in safety. The nervous system that organized around survival can reorganize around thriving. The breath that learned to stay shallow can remember the depths of its own capacity. Your body is not broken. It is not betraying you. It is the sacred vessel that has been carrying your lineage's unfinished business, waiting for someone conscious enough to finally translate its messages from symptoms into gifts, from contraction into expansion, from survival into the full, breathtaking permission to be authentically, unapologetically alive. In the deepest archives of Tibetan wisdom, there is a teaching about the Rigpa, the primordial awareness that exists before identity, before story, before even the first breath that announces our arrival in this world. It is said that in those moments between conception and birth, consciousness exists in its purest form, unmarked by experience, yet infinitely sensitive to the emotional atmosphere it will soon call home. What if healing your deepest fear is not about remembering something specific that happened to you, but about returning to that primordial state and offering it what it needed then, but never received? What if the terror that lives in your bones is not a personal failing but a sacred assignment? The accumulated yearning of your entire lineage for someone brave enough to finally feel what was too dangerous for them to feel. There is a practice that comes from the ancient tradition of soul retrieval, where shamans would journey to recover parts of the soul that had become lost or fragmented due to trauma. But there is a deeper retrieval that is possible, not just recovering parts of your own soul, but retrieving the soul fragments of your ancestry, the pieces of aliveness that were abandoned in moments of terror or grief, waiting in the cellular darkness for someone to finally come back for them. She sits in meditation, 45 years old, finally understanding why she has always felt like a visitor in her own life. In the stillness, she feels herself sinking deeper than thought, deeper than memory, into the space before her name existed. There, in that wordless darkness, she encounters not a trauma, but an absence, the echo of a welcome that never came, the reverberation of love that was too overwhelmed to fully arrive. "I see you," she whispers to that pre-birth consciousness. "I feel you. Your existence is not a burden, it is a gift this world needed." And for the first time in her life, her nervous system relaxes into the truth that she belongs here, that she was always meant to be here, that her arrival was not a mistake, but a miracle that simply needed someone, even if it was her adult self, to finally witness its beauty. This is healing at the level of origin, not fixing what is broken, but restoring what was never properly welcomed, not overcoming fear, but transforming it from a message of danger into a message of longing, the soul's deepest yearning to finally be met with the kind of presence that says, "Yes, you were meant to be here. Yes, your sensitivity is a gift. Yes, the very qualities that make you feel different are the ones this world has been waiting for." The Swiss psychiatrist Alice Miller spent her career understanding how children adapt to emotional environments that cannot hold their full truth. But she also recognized that within every adaptation lies the seed of authentic self that was never lost, only hidden, waiting for someone, a therapist, a friend, or ultimately ourselves, to create the emotional safety it needed to finally emerge. Your deepest fear might be the concentrated essence of your lineage's unfinished love story, all the welcomes that were interrupted by survival needs, all the emotional holding that was disrupted by overwhelm, all the celebrations of existence that were postponed by circumstances beyond anyone's control. You are not carrying this fear as punishment. You are carrying it as possibility. The possibility that what was never completed can finally find its resolution through your willingness to feel it fully and transform it consciously. Joseph Campbell spoke of the hero's journey as a movement from separation through initiation to return. But there is a journey that precedes even separation, the journey from non-being into being, from the void into form, from the cosmic darkness into the vulnerable light of individual existence. Your deepest terror may be the echo of that original journey, and healing it requires not just therapeutic work, but a kind of cosmic reparenting, where you become the conscious adult who can finally welcome the consciousness that arrived before you had the capacity to welcome yourself. It is not about remembering with the mind, but rescuing with the soul what was once felt without words. It is about becoming the parent to your own arrival that your parents, limited by their own unhealed fears, could not fully be. It is about offering your pre-birth consciousness the gift of being truly seen, truly felt, truly celebrated for the miracle of its existence. Deep fear is sometimes the pain of a self that was never welcomed in its first gesture of existing, not because those who were meant to welcome it were malicious, but because they too were carrying their own unwelcomed selves, their own inherited terrors, their own cellular memories of not belonging. Healing this fear is a ritual of reconnection with the symbolic origin of your being, before ego learned to defend, before the world taught you to contract, before anyone ever suggested that your existence needed justification. It is a return to the truth that you were born not as a problem to be solved, but as a mystery to be celebrated, not as a burden to be carried, but as a gift this universe was incomplete without. In the moments when the old fear arises, that existential terror that whispers, "Maybe I shouldn't be here," you can breathe into it the way you might breathe life back into an abandoned child. You can speak to it the way you would speak to any frightened being who needs to hear that their existence matters, that they are welcome, that they were always meant to be here. Your deepest fear is not your enemy. It is your ancestry's deepest longing, distilled into your sensitive nervous system, asking you to be the one who finally transforms terror into trust, isolation into belonging, the fear of existing into the celebration of being authentically, wildly, beautifully alive. This is your sacred assignment, not to fix what was never broken, but to welcome what was never properly received. Not to overcome the fear, but to transform it from a message of exile into a message of homecoming, the soul's ultimate recognition that it was always meant to be here, that its arrival was never a mistake, and that the very sensitivity that carries the pain also carries the medicine this world desperately needs. What archetypal fear do you recognize moving through your lineage? What pre-birth terror might be asking for your conscious attention and healing? Share your insights in the comments. Sometimes naming these inherited patterns helps break their unconscious hold over us. And if this resonated with something deep in your cellular memory, subscribe to continue this journey of archetypal healing together. I'll see you in the next video, where we explore how to transform inherited shame into authentic power. Your deepest fear might be a memory from before you were born, but your capacity to heal it is being born in this very moment, in the sacred space where consciousness meets compassion, where terror transforms into trust, where the unwelcomed finally find their way home.